Good morning, everybody, and happy Memorial Day. If you're in the U.S., today's a day where we remember those that have fallen and died in war for us. So let's take a minute and really appreciate the fact of what we have and why we have it, and in our hearts, thank those that are no longer with us and for serving on our behalf. All right. So today, I think what we'll do in commemoration of Memorial Day is what we're going to talk about is some of the wars that have gone on in the US, including what's going on now, how they've affected the economy as a whole, how they've affected currencies as a whole, what the Fed has done, grown, become during these different times, and then how those wars affect us, the people, and in the short term and in the long term. So let's start off with one of the most obvious wars that my father-in-law was in and was wounded twice in the Japanese end, which is World War II. So World War II, let's talk about it. The U.S. got involved in 1941, of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We then declared war on Japan, which obviously led to us being at war with Germany and Italy as well. And we got involved after our attack. And the interesting thing was we were going through a very difficult economic time already. So we had the crash of 29, and then with policy errors, let's just call it policy errors, the crash of 29 extended itself through 1933, and we were still very much well below the 29 levels in 1941 when we got involved with the war. So we got involved with the war, and what does a war do for a country back then? So wars were primarily, it was soldiers. There were tanks, missiles, bombs, bullets, airplanes, all the resources for human beings. That's, a lot of people, I don't know if you know this, but Hershey's chocolate effectively exists because of the contract they got with the U.S. government during World War II. So did a lot of the cigarette companies. And those contracts led those companies to become what they are now. So in the private sector, outside of the obvious, which is defense companies, which is probably more applicable to today than it was back then, although I don't know. I don't think there was much private kind of wartime activity or companies back then. There certainly are now. Everybody knows who Halliburton is at this point, and questions how that came to be, and certain wars we were involved in, and certain advice we got about those wars that we got involved in based on who owns Halliburton. And I believe most of you are well aware of that fact. So so back in World War II, it would really increase production. Okay, so it would increase production, and then when you increase production in a country that is that is based on production, you're still in the industrial era, right? So your exports, not that they don't play a role now, of course they do. The economies are just more complex now, so there's more that goes into it. But as we're pumping out all this stuff for these wartime efforts, because we're not just supporting the U.S., we're supporting all the allies as well, right? So we're pumping all this out. Naturally, that's going to have a at least mid to longer term positive effect on the U.S. Now, there was a couple of factors that even made World War II have a much greater effect on the U.S. economy. And if someone asked me what the real driver was, I would say all the building, all the factory, all the output, all the production. Okay, that would help you for a few years. All right. Now, if you read, it's going to say mid to long term. So that's what I'm going to say. In my opinion, I think that that's probably a short term positive. I don't think there's any mid or long term positive to that. Thankfully, we're the U.S., so we've never been attacked on our soil, so there's never been any rebuilding that's needed to take place. Although in other countries, that can certainly lead to economic growth as well. I think, and what I would say, the real effect for the U.S. economy in the long term from World War II was that we became the world reserve currency in 1944. So, what does it mean when you become the world reserve currency? Well, it's pretty simple. It effectively means that most international trade is going to be based on your currency. So, in this case, the US dollar. So, the world now, as they transact, they are going to transact in the US dollar. So, what does that do to the US dollar? Well, it does a couple of things. One, it gives you great economic strength because there is a constant demand for your currency. And as you know, demand is what drives the increase in price of anything. So if there's a high demand and supply were at a constant, then what would happen to prices? They would skyrocket. But if there's a new high demand, however, supply it's limited to an effect because we are tied to gold in 1944, don't forget. So what happens to our economy? It automatically bolsters it. How much money comes in exactly? It's very, very tough to say. But in 1944, effectively, it was $13 billion, which would be the equivalent of 130 billion today. Okay. So what does that do for us? Well, it does everything because when you're the world reserve currency, it is the place where any country in the world, their money is the safest because it creates economic stability. Okay, so you're going to have whoever is the world reserve currency will have the most economic stability. We'll get into why in a second. So you're going to be the most stable country. You also have the most stable growth. Okay, now you will run in to certain issues when you're the world reserve currency because you are now also semi-responsible for the world economy. Everybody is facilitating their trades in your money. And if everybody is facilitating their trades in your money, you are attached to those places because you have the biggest influence on them. Because you hold the supply of the dollars that they need to transact business. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that also, in some ways, does turn you into the world police. So we say we should just stay out of everything. It's not, look, I agree that you should take care of your house first. However, if you are the supply, the mechanism in which someone is carrying out something terrible and you have an influence over that, you should influence that. However, now here's the other side. I'm a very, impartial guy. Here's the other side of that argument. Who's to say what's right and what's wrong at what time? Well, in this country, who's to say that is the prevailing party that is in power at the time. So they're going to make a lot of those decisions. And that's where being a republic comes into play and why it is so important that you have a system that is of the will of the people and not the will of the government itself. So what else happens? So we're tied to gold, right? We're run on gold currency, on the gold reserve, right? So we're tied to the gold brick, whatever. It's at $35 an ounce. Imagine that, $35 an ounce in 1944. We're at what, $2,200 an ounce now? So what that does for us is that carries us all. Now that well, wait, before I go to where that carries us to, what that can also do is create a lot of inflation because you are in fact pushing a lot of currency into the market. So that can create an inflationary environment, which inflationary environments to an extent are beneficial to a country. They do at a certain point become detrimental once they're affecting the citizens to a degree that they can no longer afford to live life. Now, that was the benefit of the gold standard. What the gold standard did in effect at $35 an ounce, what it did in effect was it kind of handcuffed the government spending. They could only take it so far. They could only take it to the point at which they held the gold. Now, we'll get into how much gold they held by 1971 in a second. But so what this will do, it'll have two effects, right? So you have the most stable economy. You also, to some degree, are responsible for geopolitical kind of events. You have a very strong influence. Let's say that you have a very strong influence on geopolitical events. Therefore, in my mind, and I think in anybody who's responsible's mind, you have responsibility there. Okay. The other thing that's going to occur is you're going to want to own all the gold, aren't you? And guess who's going to want to sell it to you? The entire world. Why are they going to want to sell it to you? They want to sell it to you because they want to exchange it for US dollars, which is now the world reserve currency. So while we are backed by a gold standard, the currency that the entire world is transacting in is US dollars. So if you have gold and you want money for it, you must give it to the United States. Right? So naturally, what's going to end up coming from that is that we're going to begin gathering the gold around the world. It's really just runoff. It's really just a side effect of becoming the world's currency, the currency reserve, and the fact that we're tied to gold, and the fact that these countries want more U.S. dollars to transact more business in. All right, so it does limit debt to be tied to gold. We're going to have to gather a lot of gold so that we can create more money, because we can't create, right at this point in time, we can't just create money because we feel like it, like we can today. All right. So now, how far does that carry us? So from 1944 to 1966 was effectively one of the strongest economic eras in U.S. history. Everybody knows the pictures of the 50s, right? We all know what that looked like. And then that leads us into about 66. Now, what happened in 66? Well, when you have to become sort of the world police or part of that, or an enormous influential piece of the world peace process, trying to keep, I mean, I hate to use the terms good and bad, but trying to keep effectively neutrality around the world, what happens is you're going to get involved in some conflicts. Now, we got involved in the Korean War, which we didn't see much effect from that. Why? Well, first off, again, there was production that probably made up for the cost of that war, but at the same time, we had just become the world's currency reserve. So we had so much money flooding in. The Korean War, it didn't have a large effect on us. Now, the people that fought in the Korean War and died in the Korean War, it had a massive effect on. I'm not overshadowing that in any way. I'm simply talking about the economies, currency, and the Fed. So we move through the Korean War, and then we get involved in something called the Vietnam War, and it also starts with President Kennedy, right? So when Kennedy comes in, there's a lot going on in this era. There's a lot happening. So we have the civil rights taking place, right? We have the Civil Rights Act trying to happen. So there's all this sort of upheaval. And then he wants to, I don't know if a lot of people know this about Kennedy, but, he wanted to get rid of a lot of the things, a lot of the services. And they are services that I don't want to say we take for granted, but we just believe exist in today's society, and a lot of people are against that. There was a lot of political conflict back then. Yeah, pretty hard to believe, right? When a president gets shot and killed in the wide open, that there was conflict. But then you also have the Vietnam War starting, and everything that went along with that. So I would say, it began this distrust for government and for government spending. So what happens is Nixon ends up coming in, and in 71, says we're going off the gold standard. And by 1973, we in fact are completely off the gold standard. Now, what I was talking about earlier, how much gold do you need to own if you're the world reserve currency and it is based off of gold? We owned about 75% of the world's gold at that time. So 75% of the world's gold was ours because it had been exchanged for dollars that these countries could transact business in. So that gave us even more clout. I talk a lot about in market supply and demand, because ultimately supply and demand and cash flow, which is effectively what the Fed is and what we're talking about in currencies. It's the supply and demand of currencies. And then cash flow is how much you have and how much you can move into the market and out of the market. And in this case, we had 75% of the commodity that backed the world reserve currency. So how much power did that give us? I mean, I don't know how you put it into numbers, but a lot. So what did that do for us? We began an economic slowdown in 66. Here we are in 73. We're in the middle of a war. Now, in this war, did it elevate production? Certainly. Was it nearly as much as World War II? No. Why? We did not have nearly the amount of ground troops on the ground. We didn't need all the shipping of tanks and food and everything overseas, which create that, believe it or not, I mean, that's exporting, that's international shipping, right? That produces a lot of money for not just the US government, but for the private sector as well. Vietnam was far less. While it was a very, very deadly war, very deadly on both sides, it also didn't bolster the way people believed World War II did. Okay. Therefore, we go off of the gold standard. So we're what, 7 years into this economic slowdown. And we say, look, what if we unshackle the government? Gold is shackles. The government can only spend so much. Everything has to be tied to gold. We have 75% of it. So we've effectively gathered all that we could. And now we have all the dollars out that we can have out. That's it. We have not, we can't, there's no, and that is debt, and we can't create any more debt. We can't issue any more debt. We can't help the world transact business, because make no mistake, we are how the world transacts business. We had to come up with something. So a lot of people reflect on going off the gold standard as simply letting the government run loose. Now, that is an effect. Okay. That is one of the effects. We're going to talk about the other effects as well. They do have unlimited spending, but it also increases their control over inflation. Now, you can say, well, look at the inflationary environment that we're in now. I'm not arguing with you about that, but what I would also say is that's also the reason that they were able to keep rates down at 0% for 20 years, which did give you immense economic upside. Okay. So there's two sides of that coin. And if anyone remembers that hyperinflationary environment that took place kind of from the mid 70s to the very early 80s, if you remember that, the reason that hyperinflation took place was because we eliminated the gold standard. So what ended up happening was, now for the very first time, the Fed can just issue money, US dollars. And we're getting a little taste of that right now. We're not at the levels that we were in the late 70s and early 80s. We're not, right? They also computed inflation very differently back then. I don't believe we're at those levels. I don't believe that we are. I believe that we are above mid-range of those levels. And you can only estimate because of the way the calculations were done then and the way that they're done now. So you kind of got it's notional. So I'm giving you my notional idea, a rough idea. And I would say we are at the high mid-range or low high range of that era. And how did that happen? Well, we started pushing money to everybody. And with very little experience being able to actually just create inflation, we also didn't exactly know how to rein it back in effectively. So we created this hyperinflationary environment. You could also argue the goods and bads of that when it comes simply to investors. So if you're someone that loves security and you invest, a time like that's phenomenal, because you're going to buy those notes, CDs, whatever it is, as long term as you can. You're going to buy them out as far as you can. Now, you have to realize if you're not truly a long-term investor and you do that, that interest rates are inversely related to the value of the underlying security. So if you buy something that goes out 20 years, you throw $100,000 into it, it's paying you $10,000 a year in interest, and it goes out 20 years, and interest rates say double. So where you bought it, it was at 10%. Now it's at 20. There's going to be points at time where your investment might be worth 50, 40. It depends on the market. So you're going to see giant fluctuations. Now, as long as you hold it to your 20 years, you get your $100,000 back. You've collected that interest year over year. So there are things that can benefit you in a high interest rate environment too, and you have to be aware of that. And commodities tend to be one of those things. A lot of people look at gold as a commodity that is amazing to own in an inflationary environment, but I have to throw out a warning to everyone here. Gold is not the world reserve currency commodity backer. It does not back us anymore. So let's talk about the price of gold from 1981 until about, well, I guess it was 2017, 2018. It's somewhere right in there. Gold was at about 1,800 an ounce in 81. And it was about 1,800 an ounce in 17 or 18. Okay. You can even talk about this notionally. For 30 years, gold was flat. Nothing happened. All right. We went through a monstrous economic boom in the 80s and in the 90s. Then we had a pretty significant downturn after the internet bubble, a few years rise into 07, then another significant economic downturn into 09. But then we had a run for another decade. Actually, that run didn't really complete until 21, so it was technically, 12 years. But come see, come saw, whatever. Another decade run. And what happened with gold? Well, it's at 2,200, I believe, now an ounce. Is gold actually, does it protect you from inflation? Does it rise when inflation rises? It's arguable. It's arguable. It is. And that's just out there for you gold bugs, just putting some economics behind this idea that gold is your safety mechanism, because for a long time it really was, because the U.S. owned 75% of it until 1971. Now, so what that ends up doing is it creates this hyperinflationary environment, okay? Then we come into the Reagan area where he pulls rates down and the economy is bolstered, but a lot of the economy is bolstered because we're simply shipping jobs and industrials overseas where it is cheaper as far as to run a company. You don't have to worry about any environmental standards. You don't have to worry about labor laws. And we ship that stuff all over there. And they call that a trickle-down effect because you made the company more profitable, which then should lead to the people being more profitable, which then leads to GDP increasing, which leads to a more profitable environment for all. And you can argue that that is what happened, but is it sustainable to consistently ship your production out of the country? Well, no, at a certain point, there's nothing left to leave. There's nothing else to give away, right? So you'll have push and pull about that conversation. I'm not trying to get too deep into it. That was the way that in 81 effectively is how we started to come out of that economic downturn that started in 66. So did the Vietnam War benefit us as a nation economically through war? I would say no, because the long-term effects of war are increased debt, which is why we had to go off the gold standard. We had no more money to give away. We had no more debt. Debt had increased to a point that we had no more of it. So we had to go off the gold standard so the world could transact business. And, also, I guess, in some ways that war could continue. It also created a lot of social upheaval, right? You saw a lot of conflict with people, a lot of protests, very similar to today. Why is it so similar to today? Well, the environment is not all that different, right? We had the oil embargo of 73, 74, skyrocketing gas prices. That should feel relatively normal. We had inflation go through the roof once we went fiat. That should feel very normal. Today, our inflationary environment is caused predominantly by the $1.5 trillion COVID relief fund. which did the same thing as going off of the gold standard did. It pushed a 50% more currency into circulation than was there prior to. So just imagine that currency in circulation in 2019 is, let's use numbers we can all understand. So in 2019, we have $1 million in circulation, and then in 2020, we make it $1.5 million. That should help you all understand why prices have risen. That feels pretty much like the same amount that I just mentioned, right? Because inflation is attached to the value of your dollar, the amount of currency in circulation. If you drip currency in circulation, you have slower inflation, right? Inflationary environments are good when they're just dripped in, but when you pump in 50% currency, it's not so good. I think everybody can feel that now. Okay, so we're coming out. We have this economic pickup that goes through the 80s and 90s. We had Desert Storm. We had Desert Storm in there. Is that responsible for more debt? Yes. Did it really produce any kind of economic upturn? No. Was it immensely supported? No. Was it disliked, hated? No. Except for the servicemen and women who served and died there, of course. Then it had an immense impact in their families and their loved ones. Outside of that, from a currency perspective, from an economic perspective, and from the perspective of the Fed, the only thing we really did was build up some debt there. Brings you into 2000. We have the internet bubble. We have the World Trade Center attack. We then go to war again. What did that do for us? Was there any economic upturn? I would say for the defense sector, yes. One person in particular, our VP, and Halliburton and all the private security. So it definitely helped the private sector. I would say significantly. Did it create any long-term benefit to the U.S. economy? I would say no. I would say it was, we sacrificed a lot of young men and women. I don't know what else it did. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have any idea. There were no weapons of mass destruction. We didn't go after any country that actually attacked the U.S. There's going to be people out there that will always argue for war. So they'll argue that somehow they were facilitated in it or whatever. What do you want me to tell you? I can tell you that a lot of the minerals that we use in our technology are located there. I can tell you there's a lot of oil located there. I can tell you that the sitting president at the time had a great interest in oil. I mean, what else can I say about it? I don't know what else it was about. I think that there was a lot of people that distrusted that war and didn't believe in it. I would say that definitely happened. But with the downturn of the housing market in 2007, which was look, everybody wants to blame Wall Street for that particular event. But the fact of the matter is, when you're working a blue collar job, a normal job, and even if it's a white collar job, I don't actually care what kind of job it is, and you own 5 homes that you can't afford and you put zero money down and you don't understand what a variable APR is, but you do understand that if you got a 30-year fixed, it would cost you, $2,000 a month, but with this variable right now, it'll only cost you $400 a month. You're doing something that you can't afford. There are players on both sides. And then, of course, Wall Street is they meet demand. If you want an asset, if there is demand for an asset, they'll create it. And then what do? They mitigate the risk by spreading the risk out to others so that they don't take a hit. And the odd thing with all of that going on is that they were the ones that received the money for the bailout, which again made no sense. $787 billion, which is only second to the $1.5 trillion we just gave away in the COVID relief fund. So that is what I would say that war led to. Now, here's where the Fed came into play there. The Fed comes in, it drops rates to 0%, which effectively we had been in since 2000 regardless, and that bolsters economic activity. Let's step into today. So we come into today's era. Now, what often comes with bad economies? Well, The world was in a terrible state in the 30s and 40s, and we had World War II. The world was in another bad state, mid 60s or so. We had Vietnam, which arguably was a US conflict, but because of who we are, affected the entire world, right? There was also the Cold War going on, so that bolstered a lot of that. The race to the moon, all of these things were going on. Here we are again in a negative economic time. And what are we viewing around the world? A lot of wars, and everybody talking about World War III. Let's talk about the Fed, currencies, and our economy right now. So, what have wars led to? So, as I mentioned when I started this conversation, the long term effect of these long lasting wars is ultimately debt. It's ultimately debt. And we carry a lot of debt. Now, let me ask you a question. If your neighborhood was the world, and you had debt and your neighbors had debt, everybody had debt in the entire neighborhood. Okay, now you're the person that dishes them out whatever they use to transact business. Let's say that in this neighborhood, to transact business, you need beach towels. And you, in your closet, you have 100 beach towels, and they have to come and get these beach towels from you at a certain rate. So they borrow one beach towel. In 5 years, they have to give you two back. And you have the closet of beach towels. And that's your debt. That's your currency. Well, what happens when your closet is down to two beach towels and you have 10 neighbors? This is a problem. And this is the problem that we're having right now. So people will bring up gold again because they think, well, this must be the Fed did this. The Fed caused this because they're in control of inflation, right? Which they are. You can't argue that. They're in control of how much currency is let out and how much currency comes in. And effectively, the government decides the spending. So the US government decides, hey, we want this money to go out. The Federal Reserve is not a federal organization. It's a private organization that transacts business on behalf of the US government. So the Fed isn't exactly responsible for the decisions being made. It's simply transacting the business for the US government. And right now, let's talk about gold. So if we're tied to gold, I hear a lot of talk about gold and safety. So let's go ahead and talk about what that means. So the US currently has, and I don't know if it's tone or ton. And I didn't look it up because I didn't really think that it mattered. But we have about 8,350 tone or ton of gold, okay, which is approximately 17% of the world's gold reserve. Second to us would be Germany, and they have about 3,500 tone or ton. Okay, so they have less than half. So when it comes to gold, we are still the major holder. So why did we distribute our gold? Why did we do that after the 70s? Because it doesn't actually hold any value anymore. It's just a metal. But others viewed it as something that held tremendous value because for so long it did. And history and what we know tends to be what we repeat over and over and over. There's a lot of talk about China and its demand for gold. Well, China currently has about 2,200 ton or tone of gold. So about 25% of what the US has. Now, if they were going to go to someone for gold because this demand is so high, who would they go to? Most likely us, right? So this idea of safety, I'm just throwing it out there because I feel that there's a lot of talk about it. Let's also talk about crypto. So when you have these environments where there's these economic downturns, and we discuss them in terms of wars because it matters. Because it matters. Because people view war as something that gets you out of a bad economy. I would argue the case that currency is, at least for the United States, what gets us out of bad economies. And what they had to do when they had reached their maximum capacity for pushing currency in the market because they were attached to gold, they had to go fiat, which effectively is a brand new currency. Now, it's nice and friendly because it feels the same. You're going from the US dollar to the US dollar. However, you're simply eliminating that standard. Now, if there was enough political upheaval and unrest throughout the world and in this country, and we had no more currency to give, and we were the world reserve currency, what we would need to do was again generate some new currency, probably one that felt a little familiar, one that people had gotten used to, and one that they could attach to something, but something that they could create more of. You see, gold is a stagnant commodity. Like, you can find more gold, but it becomes harder. And how much can you find? And there is this limited supply of gold. But let me ask you this. In the new digital world that we're all living, and it's not arguable that we're living in the digital world, we are living in a digital world. In this new digital world that we're living in, what's the likelihood that we reverse back to the days of the gold standard? And I can't even attempt to give you a value of what that would do to world economies, but it wouldn't be a world you'd want to live in for however long it took to fix that nightmare. And I can tell you that people don't like not being able to afford rent and food. If you don't believe me, you can look around right now. That's one way you can go. Another way you can go is in this new digital world, you can have a US dollar that is attached to something that can grow. How about a digital currency? I mean, I don't know a lot about mining. I don't understand a lot about the mining process of Bitcoin. I don't know how it makes sense. I don't understand the values. That's beyond me. I'd have to bring someone on to talk to him about that or learn a bit more about it. But what I can tell you is that they can create more, but they can create more at a certain level. So if we get ourselves into a situation again where we've seen World War II, great economic bolster, Vietnam, minimal, and then ultimately debt. Since then, long-term effect of war, debt. So war's not going to help the economy any longer. We're not going to look to that. So this fear of World War III in the US, I doubt it. Very, very strongly. Now, the US needing to go to a new currency, I don't doubt. And I don't doubt what that currency will be, because you can see how this works. We step. You figure things out. You make your mistakes. Then you fix them. Then you move on. We do that as people, as human beings, and our government does that as well, because they're learning too. And for anyone out there that thinks they're just going to sit here while all this happens and no one's trying to solve these problems, you are delusional. That is exactly what we do. Now, if I know these problems exist and you know these problems exist, you don't think that those people know these problems exist and they're not in some think tank working this out? I mean, I just worked it out with you. My opinion as just a normal person. Yes, I'm in finance and I do understand how it works, but this isn't a wild thought process. So, we become the world reserve currency. All this money comes flooding to us. We're the safety of the world, so everybody's sending their money to us. We're tied to gold. Gold is of limited supply, so we effectively use up that limited supply by 1971. So the world has to keep transacting business, and so do we. And we're basically running the world economy because we're the world's bank. So we say, hey, we got to remove this gold standard. So we do it. Kind of mess that up. It creates a hyperinflationary environment. We get our first lesson in fiat currency. We sort of figure it out from there. We keep things flowing pretty well. Truth be told, you have to give the Fed really an A+ for what they've done and what these Fed Reserve chairmen have been able to do, given the fact that they took the shackles off the U.S. government. And very recently, the U.S. government has figured out exactly what that means. So we have a political issue that definitely needs solved. Just because the shackles are undone, it doesn't mean that you just run wild like a 3-year-old, which they do, and it's ridiculous. You serve the government. What are you doing living in a $5 million mansion? How do you have hundreds of millions of dollars if you're serving in the U.S. government? I understand that you are allowed to transact business, and I understand that you are responsible for legislation, but perhaps the shackles that should be put on them are term limits and some of the same insider trading or insider. It's not just trading stocks, by the way, folks. If you know that you're going to jack up rates, if you're going to distribute 1.5 trillion dollars, and you know what that does to inflation, while most of the country was asleep while all this happened, and there's probably a lot of people that still have no idea that that happened, but you know because you're the one that's going to sign it, and then you take advantage of that. There has to be a law, restriction, something. Because what's happened is the US government is actually the world's bank at this point, and they just run wild like 3-year-olds. And then they take advantage of it. So term limits would put an end to that. So perhaps something like that, maybe that's the shackle it needs put on. As far as the Fed goes and everybody attacking them, I think you're just slightly misguided as to what they do. That's all. I just think you don't know what they do. But what we do know is when we took the shackles off, it went wild, right? Stayed moderately in control up until the Bush era, I guess. And then you can argue that, Clinton did the Fair Housing Act, which then bolstered all this real estate. And then there's, when there's demand for real estate, there's demand for mortgages. And then they had to figure out how to get all these people mortgages. So they started creating all these fun no income regulations, and it doesn't matter how much money you make or how much no money you make. And now we have variable APRs that you certainly don't understand, but basically just means that your rate floats from month to month based on the interest rates being carried, but you don't have anything to worry about because interest rates are at zero. But what that did is that flushed so much credit into the market that Wall Street got involved, and they started creating all these tranches for mortgages and selling them. And I don't think anybody to this day has any idea how much money was involved in that, which created a credit freeze. We had 2 money market C's in the U.S., which basically we have 5 money markets in the U.S. 2 of them, broke. They broke the dollar. One more would have done that. We'd have been fighting each other with bow and arrows and sticks, and it would have been a disaster. So we move into today. We've learned these 2 lessons. So what is the next logical step? Well, we can't let government run free anymore. This is the easiest. Everyone understands that right now. That's why we have this conflict. That's why there's this conflict between the government and the people at the moment, because the people are like, whoa, this is ridiculous. Why are you living better than the private sector? You're not even held to any sort of responsibility. Almost everything you do fails. You're terrible at managing money. You're terrible at managing risk. Why are you making all this money for being a screw up? And hey, listen, that's acceptable. And I feel that same way. But what you can't say is, hey, let's point, it's the Fed. It's the Fed. And I'll tell you why you're pointing at the Fed, because you're being pointed at the Fed. Politicians don't want you pointing at them. They don't want to explain the fact that they sign the bills that issue the trillions of dollars in debt. The Fed is simply carrying out instruction. And then they have to figure out how to work it within the economy so we don't implode. And if the Fed was no good, believe me, we would already have imploded. The world would already have imploded, but it hasn't. I digress. Obviously, I have feelings on the subject. I have feelings on many subjects. So what's the next logical step? We have to handcuff government spending, but we have to do it in a manner that we have an asset that has the ability to increase as the economy increases. And that, my friends, is the conversation about crypto. Then you enter the conversation about crypto. Now, if you want to go down the road of, is it going to be Bitcoin or is it going to be some US-led currency, or how's that going to work? We can definitely do that. And what we would do is we would talk about processes that have existed historically that have done very, very well, created by the private sector, that the government then takes over, basically banishes with regulation, and then creates their own? Or do they go and cooperate with the private sector in one way, shape, or form? I'll give you a hint. They stay in charge. They stay in charge. That's the answer. We can get into how that happened. If you want to study that a little bit, I would suggest that you look at the US stock market from, say, 1913, interesting date, through 1930, and look at the events that took place. Who created the stock market? Why was it created? How were the roaring 20s created? How did the crash of 29 happen? What was the crash of 28, and why haven't you heard of it? What policies led to the initial 50% drop in stock price to the eventual 92% stock price drop of 33? If you start comparing that to some things that have gone on in Bitcoin over the last decade, that's your answer. But I'm going to discuss that in my next live. I didn't want this to be too overwhelming because I gave you a lot of information. So, in summation to this, what do wars do to economies? Well, in the old days, back when in World War II, it bolstered economies, the U.S. economy, private sector, public sector, tremendously. I would argue for the short to midterm, because I believe that the U.S. going on the world reserve currency in 44 was the ultimate driver until 66. So it did create debt, but it also, we were part of the economic reconstruction of Europe. I mean, it did a lot of things, okay? Because there was a lot of damage done in wars back then. Look what we did to Japan. And then we rebuilt Japan, right? And we helped rebuild it. So just imagine all that money. So all of these contracts are going out all over the world. We're rebuilding. We were building all the planes and missiles and tanks for all of the allies, right? We had the U.S. troops go over there. We had to feed them chocolates, cigarettes. So huge expansion. What happened in the 60s? Far, far less. And there wasn't even the Vietnam War effectively just led to long-term debt. That was where the Carter era came in, and that is why Jimmy Carter is the only standing president that was never involved in a war, because he saw the economic, it's not just about the economy, folks. It just happens to be the subject matter I'm covering. But he saw that economic effect and he thought, I'm not going to be involved any further in that. Also in his era was the hyperinflation, which everybody blames on him. Fact of the matter is, it had more to do with us coming off of the gold standard and not really having ever done that before. Of course, we messed it up. When was the last time you did something for the first time and it went swimmingly? So that created a lot of long-term debt. Now, I would go so far as to say that long-term debt was mitigated by the fact that we created that fiat currency. So we kind of escaped that bullet. We dodged that bullet. The wars from, say, 2000 till now, there's no bullet to dodge. And that's why you're seeing debt expand the way it is. Now, do we have a responsibility to the world to be a purveyor of peace, or at least our idea of peace or our assumption of peace? Yes, we do, because we have a great impact on what people are allowed to do because they transact in US dollars. And also, when someone's transacting in US dollars, they're giving you money every year, right? So when someone pays you, you have some sort of responsibility towards them, or you should have some sort of responsibility towards them. Okay, there's a lot of people out there that would say that you don't. I disagree. I feel you do. So that is all catching up with us. So finally, those wars have done nothing for us economically. You could argue the private sector, companies like Halliburton and some of that private stuff really worked out for the Iraqi war. Outside that, I don't see where you can come up with any benefits for any of this stuff. It's just human death, human loss. Our poor, the soldiers, they're going in there at 18 years old, 20 years old. God bless them for doing what they're doing, but they don't realize what they're doing, and they're going over there. And, I'm not 100% sure what for at this point. Because with the ability to suppress economies, in forced negotiation, I feel a lot of this can be avoided. And you do have to, when you're a leader, and we are a leader, you can't blindly stand by anyone, in my opinion. We all have to be held to a standard. The problem is a lot of these standards aren't put in place. And I think that what we see going on in the world right now is, I think people are ready to start seeing a standard for what we can and cannot do, reasons we can and cannot do things. I know I am. Term limits can have a negative effect because it's a skill to negotiate. It's a skill to work within that political sphere. The problem is when someone's making it a career, ties become far too tight. It's just a human response, everybody. If you've known someone for 40 to 50 years, believe me that you have a bias towards them. And that's what goes on now. But what do you do if you're just constantly throwing a bunch of rookies into the US government that don't know how to negotiate? What do you do if you just throw, people say, well, I want a businessman. Great. And you can have some of those. But if you simply throw a businessman in there, everything's going to be business. You just have to realize that it's all negotiations. Human life is it's collateral damage, right? No, we need this contract. We need it to be this way. If we have to use, force to get it there, that's what we're going to do. That's business. Business has to produce. The public sector, the government sector, they wouldn't understand that. They don't have to produce. They just have lofty thoughts that they screw up. So there does have to be some order in there. So while I say term limits are the answer, there also has to be standards set in place before that will even matter. Otherwise, we'll turn the world into chaos again. If you don't believe me, just take a look at Africa. They're overturning governments constantly. Has it solved any of their problems? No. Do they have a Fed Reserve? No. So is the Fed Reserve the problem? No. They have the largest inflationary environments in the world. If you want to know what the world would look like without a Fed, it'd look like Bitcoin going up and down by 90% every few years. In fact, it'd be worse than that. Because that's, believe it or not, that's a very, very, very small subsector of the global economy. Very small. And look what happens over there. And you have a lot of sharks over there taking advantage of a lot of guppies that don't know any better. That's another thing that goes on when you don't have regulation. So I think what I'm concluding with here is that I believe that wars don't bolster economies anymore. I believe that they cause economic problems from an economic standpoint. It's just problems. It's long-term debt. I don't believe that they create this togetherness that happened in World War II. People believe they were fighting for something that was bigger than themselves, and that brought us together. It did not separate us. The initial point of separation, I think we saw, was in Vietnam, where the public felt that too much innocent death had occurred, and that upsets them. Obviously, they didn't see the gain in it from a global standpoint or from a U.S. standpoint, because people don't want to see people killed for money. I'm sorry. If they believe something's done over money, that's going to cause enormous unrest. All right, going on and on here. I don't mean to do that, but I could talk about this stuff for days, let alone hours. So I do believe, when people talk about Bitcoin, I do believe that some sort of a digital currency is in the future. I do believe that the U.S. will remain the world reserve currency, because I don't see any reason that it wouldn't. It's done an amazing job for the world. We still do an amazing job. We have lots and lots of problems, but we are the freest nation on earth. And we have our men and women in service to thank for that. So thank you, anyone that has served. I know today is Memorial Day, so God bless anybody that has died serving for this country, but it also affects their families. And that's why Memorial Day is so important. And we do have a group of people that we can thank for that. And that is our servicemen and women. And we should do so, because they're out there doing the toughest job in the world, the scariest job in the world, and they're doing it when they're kids. So I'm going to end on that today, and I will pick up and discuss the Bitcoin and U.S. government kind of push and pull. As I told you, hint, hint, that the U.S. government will traditionally maintain control for very good reason. And we'll talk about all the points next time. If you have any questions or comments, please share them. And thank you so much. Happy Memorial Day, everyone. If you are today a serviceman or servicewoman, or the family of someone who has passed away, and you are having a tough day, reach out to someone. Today's a day where everyone cares and everybody's worried about you, and everybody cares about you. And we're all singing either your losses or your service. I realize what Memorial Day is, folks, but I think today is a day for all servicemen and women, obviously, including the ones that are still alive. Today is in recognition of those that have passed. But if you're having a tough day, remember tomorrow will be better. Listen, you've probably seen horrific things or felt horrific pain due to your loss. Tomorrow will be a better day. And remember that every day above ground is a good day. It's a great day. And we have our servicemen and women to thank for that. So thank you very much. Happy Memorial Day, everybody.